you can be in a really great place in your life while still feeling as though you have no idea what you're doing and what's going on. You feel like you can't have both of those be true at the same time, but it actually can, and it often is.
I feel like you've got everything figured out.
You're wrong.
That's a really good sign that you're about to run yourself into the ground, because you're deluding yourself. No one has all the answers.
Yeah. The more that you can recognize that you don't know and that things are uncertain, the more accurate your understanding of reality probably is. In our podcast on teenagehood and rebellion, we kind of talk about how a lot of what the teenage years are for is kind of reaching for and trying to build some sense of identity for yourself that is separate from the validation of your parents. And how a lot of young people are really struggling to do that in a very constructive and effective way.
Yeah.
And we've talked to a lot of young people that'll just be like, yeah, I'm like really interested in studying law. And it's like, are you like, have you done that? Like, have you tried it before? And
I think like that's the kind of thing that like parents will hear and be like, oh, good job, Billy.
The reason why they're saying that is because every time they've said that to somebody, they're like, oh, wow, that's so wonderful. Like, you must be so smart. And so they're just like hearing that all the time and constantly getting validation. And so they're just kind of seeing like, oh, what do I need to say to make people think that I'm smart or that I'm doing a good thing with my life?
Yeah.
And it's like, if
going in the right direction.
Yeah, because you don't really have a good foundation for crafting a good identity, then you're kind of being conditioned into one. Yeah. And that's really, really dangerous, because as we talked about in the Inside Out podcast we did, like, your identity shapes your entire perception. Like, you have millions of bits of information coming in from all your senses every second, but you can only perceive like 10 to 60 bits per second in your conscious mind. And so your subconscious is trying to come up with the filtering process of, what should I bring to your attention? Out of all the things that you could be focusing on right now, what are you actually thinking about and perceiving and aware of? And that selection process is solely kind of like hinging on your identity, right? Because if I'm like super into lights, I might be like, wow, look at those lights over there, right? Yeah. But like, it's like that just kind of depends on like, what do you care about? What's important to you?
Well, it's like your identity will be a big part of what shapes your goal function, and then your goal function completely shapes what you perceive and how you react to it. So identity is definitely important.
Yeah. And we kind of wanted to talk about one of our favorite movies is Peaceful Warrior, and it kind of goes through, it's really deep. It has a lot in there, and it's a big foundation of our philosophy for life more broadly. But one big aspect of the story is essentially kind of talking about identity and an identity crisis. This is something that I think is really important for everybody to contend with, because I think either like for a lot of teenagers, because you're in such an isolated and like environment and you're in this bubble of school, it's very easy to kind of be conditioned into a very simplistic identity for yourself.
Yeah.
But if you don't think through one that's actually very good, then you are bound to, it's inevitable that you're gonna kind of like either reach some kind of identity crisis later in your life, or oftentimes this kind of manifests in a midlife crisis, which is the original thing that kind of led us to think about this topic.
Yeah, well, like, you can see this with the main character, where it's this, like, you know, young dude who's in college, and, like,
he's got everything going for him.
Yeah.
You know, his parents are wealthy, he's at great college, you know.
Just looking at, like, the high school stereotypes, you'll be able to see this, where, like, there's, like, the nerds who are smart,
right?
And they're
and
the
jocks who are buff.
Yeah, well, there are the pretty girls and the nerds, and then there are the jocks, and he's a jock. He's a buff guy.
Well, he's a gymnast, and he's like very close to qualifying for the Olympics, and that's like all he cares about. He's not a very good friend because that's not part of his goal function. His goal function is winning the gold medal at the Olympics.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think that, like, this isn't like totally spelled out, but it doesn't need to be. Because they do such an amazing job at portraying like how someone would act when they have such a fixed goal. That's like way too narrow. Like that's way too narrow.
There's also a difference between like the goal function that shapes your identity and what you perceive, and then having kind of like short-term goals. Because if he, for example, he had a sense of identity of like, I want to be healthy, I want to try to be the best version of myself, and then a short-term goal is like, hey, I'm really good at gymnastics, I can try out for the Olympics, right? That's one thing. But you know, when he meets this guy at a gas station who he calls Socrates, just as a joke, because he's always saying these like philosophical things, then he's like, you know, this is the only thing that I care about. Like, once I get this, I can finally be happy. You know, and it's so clear because he's also kind of like, oh yeah, I'm like training, and then Socrates like, training for what? Like, he's not even explaining what he does because that's all he thinks about, so he can't even perceive the other people who don't perceive that, right? That's his whole world. And so to fathom that, like, that other people might not watch the Olympics or care about the Olympics, to him is like, that's not even occurring to him because he's so fixed in that mindset.
If you're so like, for a while I was like really into doing hair. And like when I met someone with long hair, I just assumed they knew I wanted to braid their hair. It sounds like really weird, but when you're a little girl, then that's like a big part of what you think about. And obviously they know, they're obviously not aware that I want to braid their hair. Like, that's nowhere near occurring to them. Like any normal person. You know? But I won't know that. I won't perceive that. So it's so skewed if you have like such a narrow goal. And you won't even realize that other people aren't perceiving that. So like in the scene, he's like, oh yeah, like I know I'm a gymnast. I train like something hours.
80 hours a week or something.
80 hours a week. I train 25 hours out of the day and 8 days out of the week, you know, basically like, just like, you know, you should respect me, you know, this is the thing. Because obviously in his mind, that's the most important thing. Is being an amazing gymnast.
And so then what this guy, like Socrates, does is he asks him, like, the one question that he can't answer, which is, if you don't qualify for the Olympics, what will you do? And then what Dan...
You could see it on his face.
And he's just like... And then he just leaves that conversation and be like, you're a freak and you're freaking me out. He drives off in his motor...
and I don't need you freaking me out.
And then he drives off on his motorcycle. I found that very funny.
If you don't make the Olympic team, what will you do?
If I don't what?
You must have thought about it.
What the hell are you talking about?
What's the problem?
You're a freak, and I don't need you freaking me out.
But it's basically it's challenging. The one thing that he, you know, that's like his ultimate blind spot is like he can't contend with this fact.
And also when you have such a narrow goal, then it's like, then you'll have such an obvious like worst fear. Which was that basically.
And it's gonna be the one that you don't think about, that it just doesn't, like, that you push out of your mind, you know.
You can't even contend with like answering that question.
And so how the story progresses, and this is kind of some spoilers, although I think it's,
spoiler alert.
which is, it's a great movie, and I think there is so much more to this than just kind of this identity progression, but it is such a great aspect of the movie, which is that he gets in a motorcycle accident and basically like shatters his leg to a point where all the doctors are like, you know, if you're very lucky because you'll be able to like walk again. And so
the basically it was just like known that like he can't ever be like a gymnast again.
And so in one of the scenes, like Socrates' daughter Joy comes and like basically like puts her hand on his chest.
Well, he's like really depressed.
Yeah.
Because like he's probably like, he hasn't even contended with the idea yet. He can't think about it, but he's, like, really depressed because he's walking around on these crutches.
Yeah.
And, like, he just can't do anything, and his identity has been completely shattered.
Yeah, exactly. And this is something that's very common in terms of, like, for athletes, the obvious thing is, like, you injure yourself and then you can't continue doing that. But basically what Joy is saying is, like, you know, I don't think your leg was the only thing that's broken, you know, just implying that his heart is broken too, because, like, obviously, you know,
she comes over to him, he's sitting in the grass, and he's like, can I try something? And then she puts her hands on his chest. It's like kind of a weird scene, but the point is, like, his heart was broken as well.
Shouldn't you be healing my leg instead of my chest?
Maybe I don't think your leg is the only thing that got broken.
Yeah. And then she also says, I know this is a scary moment for you. Are you paying attention to it?
I know this is a scary moment for you. Are you paying attention to it?
Yeah.
Because it's kind of like, you know, all these things in his mind are being forced to kind of unravel, and he needs to contend with that identity question again. And so basically, like, he kind of goes through, like, the 5 stages of grief, essentially grieving his own sense of self. Like, in his mind, it's like he died, because all he cared about, all he thought that he was gymnastics, and now it's gone, right? And so
he's, like, grieving an old version of himself.
Yeah. And so then the second stage of grief is anger, and there's one scene where it's, like, smashing all his trophies with his cane. There's a scene where he, like, lets himself go on the top of the clock tower, which is, like, I think in our mind is indicating he's basically letting his old self die, but at the same time he's still alive, right? And so he needs to kind of contend with that question. And so the kind of the next progression is that,
well, he goes back to Socrates, because, like, before he like, when he first met Socrates, he got the old guy, he got Dan's attention by doing, like, an insane jump. And because that was in his realm of, like, his goal, which is, like, oh, I'm the best gymnast, you know?
Yeah.
And then Socrates basically starts, like, getting him to, like, question his identity.
Yeah. Well, that's what the actual Socrates did, was he asked people questions until they kind of had, like, an existential question. Which is why then everybody wanted to kill him.
And then Dan, because that's like super scary, he just completely he gets angry at Socrates several times and scared, and then he just leaves.
Well, it's kind of like, you know, Socrates was the only person in his life that wasn't in that sort of realm. You know, all his friends were doing gymnastics with him. You know, he knew his coach, and then he knew all these other students who knew him as the guy who does gymnastics, because, like, you know, that's probably how he introduces, like, hey, I'm, like, trying to qualify for the Olympics, you know, because that's all he thought about. Yeah, and so it's like he's going to the one person that was seeing him for more than just, you know, that, you know. So then basically after that, he's kind of saying, like, hey, you know, this is after some time has passed. He's saying, like, you know, I'm going to try to, you know, do, like, service to others. Socrates was, talking to him about, like, service to others and how, you know, this is the highest purpose and how you can really find fulfillment. And he's like, yep, I don't want to do the gymnastics thing anymore. You know, I'm ready to be this better, bigger person.
I think I'm ready.
Ready for what?
Devoting my life to a higher purpose.
Really?
Service to others, right?
You know, and then Socrates tells him, I think you should continue your training as a gymnast.
I'll do whatever you think I should.
All right.
All right.
I think you should continue your training as a gymnast.
And the reason why is because...
He's like, what?
Yeah, and he's just like, look at me! And then he, like, shows him his leg, and he's just, like, getting angry. He's like,
I have a rod in my leg, dude.
A warrior does not give up what he loves, Dan.
Look at me! Look at me.
A warrior's not about perfection, or victory, or invulnerability. He's about absolute vulnerability. That's the only true courage.
Yeah, and it's kind of like something where his reaction kind of indicates that this was something that he needed to contend with, because to say like, oh, I'm going to go do service to others and ignoring the gymnastics part, when that is a big part of like who he is and what he's done with his life, is running from that old identity so he won't have to contend with it anymore. And what Socrates is basically telling him is like, hey, you know, this is what you love to do. You know, this is what you've been doing for your whole life. And to ignore that is to ignore reality. You know, it's to hide from this thing that has hurt you, you know, but it's not like, but it's helping him to transcend from, because before, the only reason why, like, he was doing gymnastics because he had this singular goal of, I'm going to try to compete in the Olympics.
Yeah.
Whereas this is now kind of forcing him to think about, you know, how can I actually go back into this, but do it, but have a better reason for it, right? Because there is a lot of cases in which, like in my own experience, there were certainly periods in my life in which I was doing the right thing for the wrong reasons, you know, and I was being like doing all like these things because I thought like, oh, you know, this is like objective things that society measures as good, and so it makes me feel good, but it's driven by like anxiety and fears of inadequacy. Whereas, you know, it's not that then I should just stop doing those things, because those things could be very productive. But it's like, why are you doing it?
Are you doing them
right?
for the right reason?
And the why behind why you're doing things is like, that's
so important.
That's like the most important part, you know, because if you have the right motivations, then you can find, you know, then you can get to where you need to go. But if you're driven by the wrong motivations, and you're going to like dig yourself into a pit that you can't come out of, you know, without help.
Yeah.
And without, you know, part of it is that this story, he had this event happen to him where he had that motorcycle accident, force him to have this identity crisis and transcend into a better one.
It's kind of like a midlife crisis in his 20s.
Yeah, but it's like most people don't, like, you know, because when they have that identity, it's kind of like a reinforcing loop where then you're gonna seek out environments and people and situations that will reinforce that identity. So it's really hard to get out of if you don't have people around you to challenge that, or situations or like experiences that will challenge that, you know. So it's kind of, this movie represents, here's what happens when one is kind of like forced into that, and then they have somebody there guiding them into helping them build a better sense of identity. But it's like, so many people don't get that sort of because they're, from an emotional standpoint, that's not something they're going to want to seek out, you know, because it's like changing your sense of identity and like doing that whole process. It feels like a part of yourself is dying. You know, it does not feel good, you know? And it's not something that in this modern age, we really have a natural mechanism for either, you know? And I think that that's why it's so important to do that early on, especially for young people, is to think about, how can I structure my identity in a way that isn't going to lead to problems down the road? Because if you have such a fixed identity, it can give you this clarity of like, oh, this is what I'm going to do with my life, you know, and we don't want to feel as though we don't know what we're doing with our life. Right. But oftentimes those are the people, that's what Socrates talks about, is like, that's the first realization of a warrior, is not knowing, is accepting that you don't have control. You don't have, you know, infinite knowledge. You know, it's the more that you can recognize that you don't know and that things are uncertain, the more accurate your understanding of reality probably is.
Yeah.
And that's something that young people aren't told. This is something I was telling you just like the other week, is like, you can still, you know, be in a really great place in your life while still feeling as though you have no idea what you're doing and what's going on. And those can be like, and you feel like you can't have both of those be true at the same time. But it actually can, and it often is.
Well, if you feel like you've got everything figured out,
You're wrong.
That's a really good sign that you're about to run yourself into the ground or something like that, you know, because you're deluding yourself.
Yeah.
No one has all the answers.
Yeah, exactly. And so I do think that there's lots of great movies can help you to understand kind of what that identity process actually is, because that identity process is a motivation process. It's a perception process. It's so ingrained in how we perceive and react to the world that it is imperceivable to us, because you can't, that when we talk about paradigms, it's like my paradigm might be that I'm wearing blue colored glasses, but I can't see the color blue with blue colored glasses on, right? How am I supposed to perceive my blue colored glasses through my blue colored glasses?
Yeah.
Right? That's why it's so dangerous, but it's also why it's so powerful, because if you set yourself in motion with the right identity, then that makes it effortless to continue to be effective and move in the right direction for the rest of your life. But I think
But if you set the wrong one,
Yeah.
then it's really, really difficult. That's also why I think this movie is like so valuable, because it kind of allows you to perceive a perception change.
Yeah.
Because it walks through it with such accuracy.
Yeah.
If you're like looking at it in the right way and you're trying to understand that.